The Kansas dust of 1878 was a language of its own, a fine red powder that spoke of thirst and endings. It settled in the creases of a man's eyes and the bottom of his soul. Silas felt it on his tongue as he led his horse down the sorry excuse for a main street in the town of Redemption, a place that had long since forgotten the meaning of its name. The air, thick with the bleating of penned sheep and the clang of a distant smithy, carried a new sound today, the oily, confident voice of a man selling what was not his to sell. Silas, a man who preferred the company of wind and sky to that of his own kind, had only come for salt and flour, a biannual pilgrimage from the solitude of his homestead. But the crowd gathered by the livery drew him in, a knot of grim-faced ranchers and slack-jawed drifters, their eyes fixed on a makeshift platform. Upon it stood not a prize bull or a spirited mare, but a woman. She was bound at the wrists with coarse rope, a filthy gag of burlap tied tight across her mouth, silencing whatever pleas or curses might live there. Her hair, a tangled black river, fell over a face smudged with dirt and despair, but her eyes were not broken. They were the color of a stormy sky over the plains, and in their depths, a wild, untamable light still flickered. The auctioneer, a portly man sweating in the unforgiving sun, was extolling her virtues with the crass poetry of a livestock trader. "Sturdy back," he bellowed, yanking her arm to show the lean muscle there. "Docile, once you teach her who's master. Not a word of complaint from this one, I guarantee it." A ripple of greasy laughter moved through the crowd. Silas felt something cold and hard clench in his gut. He had seen predators in the wild, the clean, honest violence of a wolf taking a deer. This was different. This was the slow, grinning cruelty of men who had lost their own humanity and sought to extinguish it in others. He thought of his ranch, the quiet order of it, the way the sun rose and set without judgment. He thought of the grave on the hill, the small, weathered cross that marked the place where his own world had ended. He had made a vow there, a silent promise to the earth that held his wife and child, that he would not stand by while the world's casual brutality chewed up another innocent soul. The bidding started low, a few dollars tossed out by men whose intentions were written plain in their leering gazes. The price climbed, fueled by whiskey and a grim, competitive spirit. Silas remained still, his hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle. He was not a wealthy man. The pouch at his belt held the profit from a year's hard labor, meant for a new plow and winter seed. But the sight of her, standing so small and so defiant against the tide of grinning faces, rerouted the course of his life. He watched as the bidding stalled, a grimy trapper looking smugly at his winning offer. And in that pause, Silas's voice, rough from disuse, cut through the air. $100. A hush fell over the crowd. The sum was absurd, an amount that could buy a small herd of cattle. The auctioneer's eyes widened. The trapper spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his face souring. "For that sack of bones?" someone muttered. Silas didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed on the auctioneer, his expression as unreadable and unmovable as the granite bluffs that bordered his land. The auctioneer, sensing no further competition, slammed his gavel down on a barrelhead. "Sold, to the quiet man in the back." Silas moved forward, the crowd parting before him like a sluggish river. He untied the leather pouch from his belt, its weight feeling both immense and insignificant, and poured the coins into the auctioneer's greedy hand. He didn't look at the man. He stepped onto the platform, pulled a small, sharp knife from his boot, and with a single, fluid motion, sliced the ropes that bound her wrists. He then reached behind her head and cut the gag, letting the foul burlap fall into the dust. She stumbled as the blood rushed back into her hands, and he caught her, his arm surprisingly gentle around her waist. She weighed almost nothing, a bird with hollow bones. He lifted her from the platform, his jaw set, and carried her through the silent, staring men, away from the stench of redemption and toward the clean, vast emptiness of the plains. The journey back to his homestead was a study in silence. He placed her on the buckboard seat, her small frame wrapped in a spare wool blanket he kept behind it, and she huddled there, a tight knot of misery and fear. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the endless sea of grass that stretched out before them, a landscape that could swallow a person whole. Silas did not press her for words. Words, he knew, were often just noise, a way to fill the spaces that were better left empty. The truest things were communicated in the quiet. The rhythmic clop of his horse's hooves, the sigh of the wind through the blue-stem grass, the steady, patient line of his shoulders as he held the reins. These were his language now. He was a man who had forgotten how to speak of comfort, but he knew how to build a fire, how to find clean water, how to move with a purpose that offered its own kind of reassurance. The sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple and soft rose, and still she did not speak. He wondered what horrors had sealed her lips, what brutalities had taught her that silence was the only shield against a world of grasping hands and ugly words. They arrived at his cabin as twilight was deepening into night, the first stars pricking the velvet dark. The place was small, built by his own hands from cottonwood and sod, a solitary sentinel against the immensity of the prairie. It was a testament to his own isolation, a fortress of grief. He lifted her down from the wagon, her feet barely seeming to touch the ground, and led her inside. The cabin was sparse, containing only a cot, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. It was the home of a man who expected nothing and no one. He gestured for her to sit by the hearth, where the embers of his morning fire still glowed faintly. While he coaxed them back to life, she remained by the door, poised for flight, her eyes darting around the small space, cataloging every shadow, every potential threat. He understood. Trust was not a gift to be given freely. It was a seed that had to be planted in barren ground and tended with patience. He ladled a thick rabbit stew, fragrant with wild onions, into a wooden bowl and set it on the table, along with a tin cup of water from the well. He placed a spoon beside it and then retreated to the far side of the room, turning his back to give her the illusion of privacy. He heard the faint scrape of the chair, the quiet clink of the spoon against the bowl. When he finally turned back, the bowl was empty. She sat staring into the fire, her hands clutched in her lap. Her stillness was absolute, the stillness of a hunted animal that knows its survival depends on invisibility. That night, he took a blanket and went to sleep in the barn, leaving the cabin and its small measure of warmth and safety to her. The smell of hay and horse was a familiar comfort, a world of simple needs and honest effort. He lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the prairie, the call of a distant coyote, the rustle of some small creature in the loft, and thought of the silent woman in his home. He had not rescued her out of a desire for companionship or for any reward. He had done it because her silent defiance had reminded him of a part of himself he thought had died with his family. The part that still believed some things were worth fighting for, even in a world determined to break them. The next days fell into a quiet rhythm. He would rise before dawn, do his chores, and leave food and water for her on the table before heading out to mend fences or check on his small herd. When he returned at dusk, the food would be gone, the dishes washed and stacked neatly. She was a ghost in his home, a presence felt but rarely seen. He would catch glimpses of her through the window, a shadow moving past the firelight, a slender figure standing in the doorway, looking out at the vast, lonely expanse of his land. He never tried to corner her, never demanded a name or a story. He simply existed alongside her, offering a silent promise of no harm. He was building a sanctuary, not with walls and locks, but with the steady, quiet bricks of respect and space. He was letting the silence do its work, hoping it would heal what the noise had broken. Weeks turned into a month. The harsh summer sun softened into the golden light of early autumn. The woman, he still had no name for her, began to venture out of the cabin during the day. He would see her from a distance, a small figure gathering wildflowers by the creek or simply standing on the porch, her face turned up to the immense blue sky. She moved with a quiet grace, her bare feet seeming to read the texture of the earth. Her presence had subtly changed the landscape of his life. The cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a shelter. He found himself looking for her as he rode in at the end of the day, a strange and unfamiliar warmth spreading in his chest when he saw her waiting on the porch. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised, violent green. His best mare, a gentle roan named Mercy, had foaled a week prior, and the colt was small and weak. As the first drops of rain began to fall, the colt went down, its small body racked with tremors, its breathing shallow and rapid. Silas knew the signs. It was lung fever, swift and merciless in the young. He had seen it take calves and lambs, and he felt a familiar, helpless despair settle over him. There was nothing he could do but wait for the inevitable. He was kneeling in the wet straw of the barn, his hand on the colt's heaving flank, when she appeared at his side. He hadn't heard her approach. She knelt opposite him, her storm-colored eyes fixed on the struggling animal. For a moment, she just watched, her expression one of intense concentration. Then, without a word, she rose and disappeared into the rain-lashed prairie. Silas watched her go, bewildered. He thought she had fled, scared off by the storm or the sight of death, but she returned minutes later, her dress soaked, her hands full of dripping green plants he didn't recognize. The feathery leaves of yarrow, the flat-topped clusters of a plant with a pungent medicinal smell, and some kind of broad-leafed dock. She went to the cabin's hearth, and using his mortar and pestle, began to crush the herbs into a dark, fragrant pulp. She worked with a focused intensity, a sureness in her hands that spoke of ancient knowledge. She mixed the pulp with hot water, creating a steaming poultice that filled the small cabin with the scent of damp earth and healing. She carried the warm mixture back to the barn in a bowl. She dipped a clean rag into it and began to gently bathe the colt's face and chest, murmuring to it in a language that wasn't English, a soft, crooning sound that was more like a song than speech. She coaxed a few drops of a tea she'd brewed from different leaves between the colt's lips. Silas watched, mesmerized. He was a man of the earth, a man who understood the cycles of life and death. But this was something else. This was not medicine. It was a kind of magic. She stayed with the colt all through the night, as the storm raged outside, a furious counterpoint to the quiet intensity of her work inside the barn. She never tired, her touch never faltering. Silas brought her a blanket and a cup of coffee, which she accepted with a small, almost imperceptible nod. He found himself not watching the colt, but watching her. The pity he had felt for her on that auction block was gone, replaced by a profound and unsettling awe. She was not the broken, helpless creature he had purchased. She was a woman of hidden power, a keeper of secrets the world had forgotten or chosen to fear. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of rain. The colt was standing on shaky legs, nuzzling its mother. Its breathing was even, the fever gone from its eyes. It was a miracle. Silas stood in the barn doorway, the morning sun warming his face, and looked at the woman who was now gently stroking the mare's neck. She looked up and met his gaze. For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear or sorrow crossed her face. It might have been pride. It might have been a question. He could not name it, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he had not rescued a victim. He had stumbled upon a force of nature, and his life, like the parched prairie after a storm, would never be the same. The first snow of winter fell silently, blanketing the prairie in a profound and holy quiet. The world shrank to the small circle of warmth cast by the cabin's hearth. It was in this enforced intimacy, with the wind howling its lonely song outside, that the silence between them finally broke. She had been mending one of his shirts by the firelight, her fingers, which had seemed so fragile, now revealing themselves to be deft and strong. The needle moved with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Silas was oiling a piece of tack, the familiar scent of leather and linseed filling the air. The fire crackled, a third presence in the room, a witness to the unspoken things that had passed between them. He had long since stopped sleeping in the barn, instead taking his bedroll to the floor by the hearth, a silent guardian in the night. The arrangement was one of mutual respect, a shared solitude that was less lonely than the solitude they had known apart. "They called us the Vadani," she said. Her voice was a surprise, low and raspy from months of disuse, like the scrape of stones in a dry riverbed. But it held a quiet music beneath the rust. Silas stopped his work, his hands going still. He did not turn to look at her, not wanting to spook the moment, to chase the words back into their silent burrow. He simply listened. "It means, those who listen to the earth in the old tongue," she continued, her eyes still on her sewing. "My mother was a healer, her mother before her. We lived in the hills, apart from the towns. We knew the secrets of the plants, the language of the seasons. People would come to us when their children were sick, when their livestock was dying, when the doctors with their saws and their mercury had failed them." She paused, and the only sound was the hiss of the fire. "But fear is a poison. A new preacher came to the valley. He spoke of witchcraft, of devil's work. He turned the people we had helped against us. They came with torches and pitchforks, their faces twisted with a righteousness that was uglier than any sin." Her needle stopped moving. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek, glittering in the firelight. "They burned our homes. They killed my mother and my sisters. I was the only one they took alive. They said they would make an example of me. They put me on that block to show what happens to women who refuse to be small, who refuse to be silent." She finally looked at him, her storm-gray eyes holding all the loss and fury of a world torn apart. "That is why I do not speak. My voice is what they feared. My knowledge is what they hated." Silas felt the weight of her story settle in the room, a sorrow so vast it seemed to dim the fire. He finally turned to her, his own heart a dull ache in his chest. He saw the raw edges of her pain and felt the echo of his own. He reached out and put his worn, calloused hand over hers, stilling the needle. Her skin was cool to the touch. "I had a wife," he said, his own voice thick. "Her name was Sarah, and we had a daughter, Lily. She was the color of a sunrise." He swallowed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It was a winter like this one. A fever came. It swept through the valley. I sent for the doctor in Redemption, but the snow was too deep. He never came. I sat with them for 3 days. I boiled water. I prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in. I held their hands until they grew cold." He looked down at his own hands, large and capable, but they had been useless when it mattered most. "I buried them myself on that hill. I built this place to be alone with my failure. I thought if I didn't have anyone to protect, I couldn't fail to protect them again." He looked back at her, his gaze direct and filled with a shared understanding of loss. "I didn't save you from those men in town. I think maybe I was trying to save myself from the man I was becoming. A man who just stands by." In the flickering light of the fire, 2 solitudes touched. They did not offer empty words of comfort. They did not try to fix what was irrevocably broken in each other. They simply sat in the shared darkness, 2 survivors bearing witness to each other's scars. And in that silent communion, something new and fragile began to take root. The thaw came, and with it, trouble. Word had trickled back to Redemption, carried by a lone trapper who had seen Silas's mare and her miraculously healthy colt. The whispers grew louder, fueled by the long, dark winter and the fear that always festered in small, isolated places. The preacher, a man named Josiah Kane, whose piety was a thin veneer over a core of cruel ambition, saw an opportunity. He spoke of the witch in the wilderness, the Jezebel who had ensnared a good, grieving man with her dark arts. He painted a picture of curses and blighted crops, of sickness that would surely spread from Silas's homestead to their own doorsteps. Fear, as she had said, was a poison, and it spread quickly. One afternoon, as Silas was splitting wood, he saw the dust cloud on the horizon. It was not a lone rider, it was a procession. He counted a dozen men on horseback, and in the fading light, he could see the glint of torchlight and rifle barrels. He straightened up, the axe handle slick in his palm, and his gaze went to the cabin. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale but her expression resolute. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a weary resignation. He walked to the porch and stood at the top of the 3 short steps, placing himself squarely between her and the approaching mob. He didn't reach for the rifle that leaned against the doorframe. His stillness was his weapon. The riders pulled up just beyond his fence line, a grim assembly of farmers and townsmen, their faces a mixture of fear and self-righteous anger. Preacher Kane sat at their head, his horse a fine black gelding, his face flushed with holy purpose. "Silas!" he called out, his voice booming with practiced authority. "We have come for the witch. Give her to us, and the Lord may yet have mercy on your soul." Silas's eyes swept over the crowd, recognizing faces, men he had traded with, men who had offered condolences after Sarah and Lily had died. He saw not monsters, but frightened sheep led by a wolf. "There is no witch here, Josiah," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. It was not a shout, but a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the earth beneath his feet. "There is only a woman A woman your town saw fit to sell like a side of beef. She is an abomination, Cain thundered, pointing a finger. She communes with dark spirits. She brought a dying animal back from the brink with her devilry. Silas took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving the preacher's. That's right, he said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. She healed my horse. She used the herbs God put on this prairie to do it. She has harmed no one. She has asked for nothing. Since she has been here, this land has known only peace. He then turned his attention to the other men, his voice losing its hard edge, taking on a note of sorrowful reason. I see you, Thomas. And you, Jacob. Your wives bought Sarah's quilts at the town fair. You know the man I am. Look at your hands. They are meant for plows and harnesses, not for holding torches against a lone woman. The only curse here is the one you're about to bring upon yourselves. A murmur went through the crowd. Men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their certainty beginning to fray at the edges. They had come for a monster, a creature of shadow and sin. They were faced with a quiet, grieving man defending a woman who had, by his account, done nothing but good. Preacher Cain, sensing his power slipping, spurred his horse forward. Do not listen to his bewitched tongue. The Lord's work must be done. But the fire in his words had lost its heat. The men were looking at each other, at Silas, at the simple, sturdy cabin behind him. They saw not a den of evil, but a home. One by one, without a word, they began to turn their horses around. A farmer named Jacob, a man whose child Silas had once pulled from a well, gave him a short, apologetic nod before riding away. Soon, only Preacher Cain was left, his face a mask of thwarted rage. He spat on the ground. You will burn for this, Silas. Both of you. He wrenched his horse's head around and galloped away, a lone, dark figure disappearing into the twilight. Silas stood on the porch until the dust settled, until the only sound was the chirp of the crickets. He turned and looked at the woman in the doorway. She had not moved. Her eyes were fixed on him, and in their depths, something new was dawning. Not awe, not gratitude, but a fragile, burgeoning trust. The immediate threat had passed, but they both knew it was only a reprieve. The shadow of redemption still loomed, long and dark, over their fragile peace. In the days that followed the mob's retreat, a new tension settled over the homestead. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Silas took to carrying his rifle with him everywhere, a habit he'd long abandoned. They were living on an island, and the sea of hatred was rising around them. The fear did not break her, however. Instead, it seemed to temper her, forging her resilience into a quiet, unyielding strength. One evening, she did something that would forever alter the geography of their shared existence. Silas came in from the barn to find her sitting by the fire with a familiar object in her lap, the rough burlap sack she had been forced to wear at the auction. He had tucked it away in a chest, meaning to burn it, to erase the symbol of her humiliation from their lives. But he had never been able to bring himself to do it, as if destroying it would be a denial of what she had endured. She had his small mending kit beside her, the one with the precious spools of colored thread he had bought for Sarah years ago. With a needle in her hand, she was not tearing the sack apart, but transforming it. She was embroidering it. Her stitches were small and precise, a language all their own. He moved closer and saw what she was creating. Across the coarse, ugly fabric, she was sewing the images of the herbs she had used to save the colt. the delicate, feathery leaves of yarrow in a soft green thread, the star-like blossoms of chamomile in white and yellow, the broad, strong leaves of the dock plant, outlined in a deep forest green. She was taking the very emblem of her bondage and overwriting it with the symbols of her power, her knowledge, her identity. It was an act of profound defiance, an act of reclamation. He watched her for over an hour. The only sounds the soft whisper of the thread passing through the cloth and the crackle of the fire. She worked with the same focused intensity he'd seen in the barn that stormy night, as if the needle were an extension of her will. Each stitch was a word in a story she was rewriting for herself. She was not the nameless, silent commodity from the auction block. She was a healer. She was Vadani. She was a survivor. When she was finished, the sack was no longer a sack. It was a tapestry, a map of her own soul. The ugly brown burlap was now a canvas for the vibrant life she had coaxed from the earth. She held it up, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. Then she stood and draped it over her shoulders. It did not hang like a garment of shame. It fell like a mantle of power, a shawl of quiet dignity. The crude opening for her head was now a collar, framed by the embroidered leaves. She stood before him, not as the woman he had rescued, but as a woman who had rescued herself. Silas felt a lump form in his throat. He understood the ceremony of the moment, the sacred weight of her gesture. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a moment before gently touching the embroidered image of a goldenrod blossom. The thread was warm from her hands. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had met her, she gave him a true smile. It was a small, fragile thing, but it transformed her face, chasing the shadows from her eyes and revealing a light he had never seen before. In that moment, he did not see a damaged woman. He saw the strongest person he had ever known. He saw a woman who could take the ugliest thing the world had to give her and turn it into a thing of beauty. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that his life was now inextricably bound to hers, not by pity or duty, but by a deep and reverent love. The embroidered shawl became a part of her. She wore it often, a quiet declaration of who she was. The air in the cabin changed. The unspoken fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface of their days. But it was now overlaid with something else, a current of shared understanding that ran deeper. They began to talk more, not of the past and its ghosts, but of the present. She taught him the names of the prairie plants, showing him which roots could soothe a fever, which leaves could be made into a tea to calm the nerves. He, in turn, told her the stories of the constellations he had learned from his father, tracing the shapes of the hunter and the great bear in the vast, starry sky. They were building a world together, a small pocket of meaning in the vast, indifferent wilderness. One night, as a full moon bathed the prairie in a ghostly silver light, he knew a decision had to be made. They could not stay here forever, living under the shadow of Josiah Cain's hatred. But to leave felt like another kind of defeat. He went to the small wooden chest at the foot of his cot, the one that held the few remaining pieces of his past life. He took out a small, tarnished silver locket. It had been Sarah's. He had given it to her on their wedding day. He carried it to the fire where she sat, her hands busy weaving dried grasses into a small, tight basket. He sat before her and held it in his palm. "This was my wife's," he said simply. He did not need to explain its significance. She understood. He used his thumbnail to pry it open. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of Sarah, her smile sweet and sad. With a reverence that felt like a prayer, he carefully removed the image and placed it in the fire. They watched as it curled, blackened, and turned to ash. It was not an act of forgetting, but an act of letting go. He was releasing the past, making room for the future. He held the empty locket out to her. "It should hold something new now," he said, his voice husky. "A new story." She looked from the empty locket to his face, her gray eyes searching his. She did not take it. Instead, she put down her basket and reached out, placing her cool, slender hand flat against his chest, directly over his heart. The steady, solid beat of it was a drum beneath her palm. "It doesn't need a picture," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It holds this. It holds a good heart." Her touch was an anchor, a promise. In that moment, the last of the walls around his own heart crumbled. He covered her hand with his, holding it there against his chest. The space between them was charged with a profound and holy intimacy. It was more than desire. It was recognition. It was the meeting of two souls who had found their other half in the most unlikely of places. "I don't know your name," he said, the admission sounding strange after all these months. "They never said it, and I never asked." She looked at him, her smile returning, gentle and luminous. "My name is Ilara." The name was beautiful, like a secret star. He repeated it, letting the sound of it fill the space between them. "Ilara." Speaking her name felt like a vow, a commitment more binding than any words a preacher could say. It was an acknowledgement of her whole self, the person she was before the world tried to erase her. She leaned forward, and he met her halfway. Their first kiss was not one of passion, but of reverence. It was as soft as moth wings, a gentle press of lips that tasted of wood smoke and sorrow, and a hope so fierce it was almost painful. It was a sealing of a pact, a promise to face whatever came next, together. In the quiet of the cabin, under the watchful eye of the prairie moon, they were no longer two separate people defined by their losses. They were one, a new story just beginning. He took the silver locket, and without putting anything inside, fastened it around her neck. It rested in the hollow of her throat, an empty vessel waiting to be filled with the life they would build together. Their quiet union was a brief, sunlit moment before the final storm broke. A week later, a man rode into their yard. He was not like the townsmen. He rode a lean, wiry horse built for speed, and he carried himself with the cold, predatory stillness of a professional. A pair of Colt revolvers were strapped low on his hips, and his eyes, the color of chipped slate, missed nothing. He was a bounty hunter. Silas met him on the porch, rifle held loosely at his side. Ilara stood just inside the doorway, her hand on the silver locket at her throat. "I'm looking for a woman," the bounty hunter said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "A runaway. Answers to the name of Witch. Preacher in Redemption put a price on her head. $500. Says she's yours." Silas's grip tightened on his rifle. "There's no one here by that name. You'd best be on your way." The bounty hunter's lips curled into a semblance of a smile. "I don't think so. I've been tracking you for 2 days. I know she's in there. Send her out, and I might just let you live." There was no reasoning with a man like this. He was a force of nature, like a drought or a blizzard. Silas knew what he had to do. "Ilara," he said, not taking his eyes off the man. "Go. Take mercy. Ride west, and don't look back." "No," she said, her voice firm from behind him. "I will not leave you." Before he could argue, The bounty hunter's hand blurred into motion. Silas was fast, but the other man was faster. The world exploded in a roar of gunfire and a searing pain in his left shoulder. He staggered back, his rifle clattering to the porch boards. He saw the bounty hunter raise his pistol for a second shot, a killing shot, and in that instant, Ilara moved. She burst from the cabin, not with a weapon, but with the heavy iron skillet from the hearth. She swung it with all her might, catching the bounty hunter square on the side of the head. He crumpled from his saddle like a sack of grain, landing in a heap in the dust. The silence that followed was deafening. Pain was a white-hot fire in Silas's shoulder. Blood was soaking his shirt, warm and sticky. "We have to go," Ilara said, her voice urgent. She helped him to his feet, her small frame surprisingly strong. The world was tilting, the edges of his vision going dark. "The horse," he managed to say. She half carried, half dragged him to the barn. With frantic efficiency, she saddled Mercy, the gentle roan mare. Getting him onto the horse was an agonizing ordeal. Every movement sent waves of nausea and fire through him. She mounted behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist to hold him steady, his head lolling back against her shoulder. "Hold on, Silas," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "Just hold on." She urged the horse into a gallop, heading west, away from the rising sun, away from the still form in the dust, away from the life they had just begun to build. They rode hard, the prairie a blur of brown and gold. Silas drifted in and out of consciousness, his world reduced to the pounding of hooves, the searing pain in his shoulder, and the steady, reassuring pressure of Ilara's arms around him. She was the anchor in his spinning world. The roles had fully reversed. He, the lonely protector, was now the one in need of protection, and she, the silenced woman he had rescued, was now his fierce and determined savior. She was no longer just listening to the earth. She was fighting it for his life, her quiet power now a burning, defiant flame. They rode through the day and into the night, a desperate two-souled creature fleeing across the vast, unforgiving plains, seeking a sanctuary they could only hope to find. They found refuge in a shallow canyon carved by a long dead river, a place of shadow and stone where they could hide from the world. Silas was fading, the fever from his wound stealing his strength and his senses. Ilara eased him from the saddle, his body a dead weight against hers. She laid him gently on a bed of dry leaves in the shelter of an overhang, his face pale and slick with sweat in the moonlight. For another woman, this would have been the end. Alone in the wilderness with a dying man, the law and its hunters behind them. But Ilara was not another woman. This was her world. The terror she must have felt was channeled into a fierce, focused calm. She tore a strip from her petticoat to bind his wound, pressing it tight to slow the bleeding. Then, leaving him in the relative safety of the rock shelter, she disappeared into the moon-drenched landscape. She moved like a spirit, her eyes scanning the ground, her hands unerringly finding what she needed. She returned with her skirt gathered up, full of her pharmacopoeia, the purple flowers of echinacea to fight the infection, the leaves of a willow tree for the fever, and a thick, sticky pine sap to seal the wound. She built a small, smokeless fire and brewed a bitter tea, forcing the warm liquid past his lips. She cleaned his wound with the water from her canteen, her touch gentle but efficient, her face illuminated by the firelight, a mask of grim determination. She made a poultice from the crushed plants and packed it into the gunshot wound, then smeared the pine sap over the binding to create a crude but effective seal. She worked all through the night, her ancient knowledge a shield against the encroaching darkness of death. She whispered to him in the old tongue, the soft, lyrical sounds a current of life poured into his failing body. She did not sleep. She watched his breathing, felt his forehead for the fever's heat, and willed him to live with an intensity that was its own form of prayer. When he woke, the world came back to him in pieces. The first thing he was aware of was the scent of sage and damp earth. The second was the cool, gentle pressure of her hand on his forehead. He opened his eyes. The morning sun was filtering through the canyon, painting the rock walls in shades of gold and rose. Ilara was sitting beside him, her face etched with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and bright. He tried to sit up, a groan escaping his lips as the wound protested. "Be still," she commanded softly, pushing him gently back down. "The fever broke an hour ago." He looked at his shoulder. The makeshift bandage was clean, the angry redness around it already starting to fade. He looked at her, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the strength that seemed to radiate from her very bones. "You saved me," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. A small, tired smile touched her lips. "We save each other," she corrected him. That was the truth of it. He had pulled her from a platform, and she had pulled him back from the edge of a grave. Their debts were paid. What was left was not obligation, but a choice. They stayed in the canyon for a week, while his strength returned. She foraged for berries and edible roots, and he watched, humbled and full of a love so profound, it felt like it was remaking him from the inside out. He had bought her for $100, a pittance for a human life. But she had given him back his own, a gift beyond price. When he was strong enough to ride, they continued west, leaving Kansas and its ghosts behind them forever. They crossed the great spine of the mountains, a grueling journey that tested them both, and descended into a green, secret valley in the Oregon Territory, a place that looked like the world reborn. It was a place where they could finally, truly begin. A year later, the valley was their home. They had built a new cabin, smaller than the first, but with wide windows that let in the morning light. It stood in a meadow of wildflowers, a creek whispering nearby, the mountains standing like silent, benevolent guardians around them. The land was gentle here, forgiving. Silas's shoulder had healed, leaving a puckered scar that he sometimes touched, a reminder not of pain, but of the moment his life had truly been given back to him. Ilara was no longer the silent, haunted creature he had met in redemption. Her voice was the music of their home, sometimes raised in the soft songs of the Vadani, sometimes in quiet laughter. She was pregnant, her body round with the promise of their future, a life created not from violence and loss, but from a stubborn, resilient love. The peaceful coda to their story was written in small, ordinary moments. It was in the way he would bring her a cup of mint tea in the morning, the steam fragrant in the cool mountain air. It was in the way she would place her hand on his back as she passed him, a simple touch that spoke volumes. He was carving a small wooden horse for the child to come, the shavings of pine falling at his feet. She was tending her garden, a lush, fragrant plot filled with the herbs of her ancestors, their healing power now used only for scraped knees and winter coughs. The sun was setting, spilling a honeyed golden light across their valley, turning the creek to a ribbon of fire. He stopped his carving and watched her as she moved among her plants, her form silhouetted against the brilliant sky, the silver locket at her throat catching the last rays of light. She looked up, as if feeling his gaze, and smiled at him. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. He thought of the journey that had brought them here, the dust and the fear, the fire and the blood. He remembered her standing on that auction block, a defiant spark in a world of darkness. And he remembered the moment she had wept in his arms one night, months after their escape, finally letting out all the pain she had held inside. "I'm damaged," she had cried, her voice thick with a sorrow that broke his heart. "They broke something in me that can't be fixed." He had held her tighter, his lips against her hair. "Then I'll spend my life fixing what they broke," he had promised. But he knew now he had been wrong. He hadn't fixed her. He couldn't. Her strength had been there all along. She had healed herself. All he had done was give her a safe place to do it. Love, he realized, wasn't about fixing someone. It was about standing beside them, a quiet witness, while they fixed themselves, and then choosing every single day to build a new world together from the broken pieces.